Today, let's talk about marriage, but not just any marriage. I want to talk about the failure of it at the end of The Woman of Color and what this means for the heroine of the story, Olivia Fairfield. This video will analyze how Olivia rejects British domesticity and wifehood at the end when she declares that she is a widow. I want to argue that this unsuccessful marriage ending is one that is rather abolitionist and pro-feminist. The failure of this marriage is not necessarily a failure on Olivia's end. Instead, I want to offer a reading that interprets the subversion of marriage and the return back home to Jamaica as an emancipation for Olivia. It's a form of liberation and agency whereby abandoning British society, Olivia is able to fully prioritize and embrace her blackness instead. And I would argue that this is a far more befitting end for her character than her being married. So there's a few things I want to look at here. First is how her father's will turns Olivia into an exchangeable commodity as both a woman and as a black woman. Secondly, I want to get into how Angelina's miraculous reappearance offers Olivia a way out of the will. And more importantly, I want to inspect Olivia's relationship to both Augustus Murden and Charles Honeywood, and how she herself has the agency in the end to reject British domesticity. Finally, I think it'll be fun to briefly draw some comparisons with modern-day film portrayals of the 18th century marriage plot. I'm more alluding to the 2013 film Belle, which is an adaptation on Dido Belle, the historical figure that The Woman of Color is based upon. I'll be incorporating scenes from the movie throughout this video just to have a nice visualization since the plots are really similar. I'll also play a short 2-minute clip at the end where we can draw comparisons to the Mr. Honeywood confession scene. So without further ado, let's get into it. With the death of her father, Olivia Fairfield is plunged into British aristocracy against her will. She is plucked out of Jamaica and crosses the seas in order to carry out the legally binding and peculiar conditions of her father's will. What we know of Olivia's predicament is two-parted. One is she is left an inheritance from her father of £60,000. However, she must marry her cousin, Augustus Murden, within 1 month of her arrival in England in order to receive it. And two, if she does not marry Augustus, or if Augustus refuses these terms, the whole fortune, I'm quoting from the book here, devolves to his brother, and Olivia's maintenance exclusively devolves on him also. The restrictive nature of these conditions turn Olivia into a commodity, an object that is relinquished in a will. She is given the possibility of inheriting a large sum, but she cannot inherit it all by herself. She must be accompanied by a white male figure. The inheritance is no longer solely hers. It was never hers alone to begin with, because it must be shared, one way or another, with the Murdens. Thus, the inheritance money and Olivia must stay within her white aristocratic side. With being given this very difficult task, Olivia was set up for failure, and what I would also interpret as a type of capturing by her father, much like how her father captured her mother and impregnated her. The same is being done to Olivia through this will by forcing her into submission to the Murdens. Thus, prior to her arrival in England, Olivia is very cautious about the business of this marriage. As Kathleen Luby points out, Olivia never entertains naive fictions about marriage. She recognizes it does not guarantee affection and that her primary function is to transfer capital. During her voyage, she hopes for love in her marriage to Augustus, but she knows she appears a mere state machine, conveyed over the water at the instigation of political contrivance. While she is optimistic in finding love in her marriage to Augustus, she is also very conscious and self-aware of how her race may complicate this and how she herself is being used for economic means. While she is placed in this position of objectivity, she's being traded around as a type of economic gain because of her inheritance and because of her father's will. Thus, Angelina's reappearance stops this trade from being completed. Olivia now is stripped away from fully assimilating into British domestic life. However, she does get the opportunity again to stay in this British domestic sphere, which she declines. Now, I want to look at a few passages. although I can't really get too deep in the analysis here because of the limited amount of time I have. However, I think it's important to look at how within these passages, the idea of being a British wife is rejected. First, I want to acknowledge an important argument by Bridget Fielder, that I have to bring up before I discuss Augustus and Mr. Honeywood in relation to Olivia. And it is one that asks us to be careful with prioritizing her relationships with white men, which can prevent readers and critics from getting a quote-unquote fuller picture of her gendered racialization. So I'll just read out the quote from the Fielder reading. Refocusing on Olivia's relationships with women rather than with men allows us to look beyond the mixed-race heroine's hypersexualization and toward a fuller picture of her gendered racialization. Shifting focus away from relationships with white men, we can then rethink the mixed-race protagonist's relation to blackness. I think Fielder's point here is extremely important and valid. However, I want to reframe how Olivia's relationship with men in the novel is portrayed, at least according to Fielder. That there's more within her relationships to Augustus and Mr. Honeywood than her just being a hypersexualized object of affection. I would like to offer another interpretation of Olivia's relationship to men that doesn't reduce her necessarily as solely an object to be coveted and courted. Specifically, looking at how she rejects any further relationship with these men by the end of the novel, instead deprioritizes the heteronormative marriage plot and instead prioritizes her relationship with her own blackness. So, I'm just going to bring up this passage on page 154 of the Broadview edition, and this scene, or this passage, is basically of Olivia and Augustus's last conversation together, and she kind of alludes to the fact that she won't be in contact with him anymore, and he kind of like loses it, and she has to be the one to speak rationally to him that this cannot work out because you're now married to someone else. So I think this scene is really interesting. So as we can see, Olivia shuts down any further direct contact with Augustus after this final meeting, saying that a correspondence must be declined for all of our sakes. The sooner you forget me, the better. Before Olivia can condemn herself from saying the same, she pauses. This short moment of silence symbolizes that she can never forget Augustus, as we will further see when she declines Mr. Honeywood's proposal and labels herself as a widow. Olivia takes control in this conversation with Augustus. Her dominance in this conversation, her being proactive in setting the boundaries between them, truly showcases a power dynamic being flipped here. In fact, she has Augustus on his knees, like begging for her forgiveness. And I think it's also interesting of this sort of like symbolism of having both men be on their knees by the end of the novel. And it's just like, you go, Olivia. So once again, Olivia is presented with an opportunity to British wifehood by Mr. Honeywood, who confesses his all too obvious feelings. From the beginning, we can see how much Mr. Honeywood is in love with her and is in awe of her. You would think that if anyone is deserving to be Olivia's husband, it would be him. If this was a Jane Austen book, he's the perfect choice, and they would be married at the very end. Instead, the twist comes in, and she declines his proposal and declares herself as a widow. So this is, again, a quote from the text. The skillful surgeon, said I, probes deep, the more speedily to heal the wound. I now, and to the last moment of my existence, shall consider myself the widowed wife of Augustus Murden. And I think there's something very powerful in declaring Augustus as being dead to her and never also being betrothed to another again. So at the end of the book, we have Olivia lose her properties and part of her inheritance to the Murdens. Now, her now ex-husband is in love with another woman, and she declines Mr. Honeywood's proposal. Also to mention her child, because they have a son, it stays with Augustus and Angelina. So while this might seem like a sad, pitiful ending for Olivia, Dido, her maid, at the very beginning, tells us to don't pity dear Missy one bit, one bit. Indeed, the dialogue between the editor and a friend at the very end of the book emphasizes that Olivia does not need to be rewarded with the quote unquote usual meed of virtue, a husband, but rather, as the mysterious editor states, virtue, like Olivia Fairfield's, may truly be said to be its own reward. I think the ending is most befitting for Olivia's steadfast, faithful character. The biblical allusions sprinkled throughout the text, her unwavering faith in God, and finally going back home to Jamaica to instruct the minds in mending the morals of our poor blacks, alludes to Olivia's larger purpose, one that is far more important than being a British wife. It's being a teacher. It's to be a visionary leader, a role model to her race. The subversion of the marriage plot presents itself as a moment of true virtuosity for Olivia, in which she completely abandons British society and leaves England with her constant supportive figure and fellow black woman Dido. By the end, she embraces her blackness and is happy to never go back to England again. So now I want to transition to the relatively fun part, and it's just watching the short clip from the movie Belle. Just to preface this scene, it's a very emotionally charged conversation where Dido Belle gets caught by her father figure, who is called Mr. Mansfield, about sneaking out and seeing Mr. Davinier, who's her love interest. And I think it's interesting if we could draw comparisons between this scene and the Mr. Honeywood confession scene. To me, I like to interpret Mr. Davinier's character as what would happen if Mr. Honeywood got the girl at the end of the book. So yeah, after the clip, it'll lead to my discussion questions for you all.
This man's ambition includes you. You will endure shame and risk your position for a man without name, who will sully yours and drag your reputation into the gutter.
I take great offense at your summation of my character, without ever even taking a moment to know me. Where is your right?
Right? I have every
That
right.
you will never have. Not until you cease from judging the entire world as those above and those below and begin to see people as people. Human beings who think and feel no more or less than you
I
do.
know there is a lady in Belsize who is waiting to be your
No,
wife.
I have an ambitious aunt in Belsize, who, like you, assumes that wealth and reputation are all that life depends on and despises love as though it were the devil's own creation.
Love! You claim love!
Yes! Yes! I love her! I love her with every breath I breathe!
Go, John. You do not deserve this.
Okay, so here are the sort of two discussion questions that I made up for the class. I'm looking forward to discussing The Woman of Color with everyone tomorrow. So, yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed this fun little video that I made.